Israeli military has stepped up airstrikes across Lebanon, including the capital Beirut, saying it is targeting Hezbollah positions.
On June 15, 2026, the United States and Iran signed a deal to end the war. Within hours, Israel's own defense minister stood up and said his country would not honor part of it. Not eventually, not after some dispute over details, hours. If you only read the headline, you'd think this story is over. A ceasefire, a reopened strait, 60 days of nuclear talks ahead. Peace on paper. On the same day, Air Force One landed in France for the G7. But the headline isn't the story. The story is what happened in the 48 hours after the ink dried, and who decided almost immediately that the agreement didn't actually apply to them.
For decades, the regime in Tehran has built a regional terror machine based on the non-stop flow of resources to its proxies across the Middle East.
You're about to hear three things you'll not find connected anywhere else. What Israel actually said about this deal in public, on the record, within a day of it being signed, where the money goes in Washington that makes it almost impossible for most of Congress to say anything critical about that, and why the people who studied these conflicts for a living think the real threat to this framework was never going to be Tehran. Before we go further, if this is the kind of story you want more of, the channel exists to find the parts of these stories nobody else is connecting. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and drop a comment telling us what you think Israel's actual play is here. We read every one. To understand why a signed deal didn't end this, you have to understand what it was actually ending. This war did not start in June. It started back in February, when years of failed nuclear negotiations between Washington and Tehran finally collapsed into open military conflict. Strikes on nuclear and missile infrastructure, a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil choke points on the planet, and a parallel front in Lebanon. Israel had been striking Hezbollah positions on and off for years, technically under a separate ceasefire that nobody fully respected. Negotiations tried and failed to close this out multiple times. Rounds in Oman in 2025, rounds in Geneva in February, a round in Islamabad in April, with Pakistan acting as the go-between because at this point, Washington and Tehran could barely talk to each other directly.
The United States and some European states persist in the imposition of unlawful sanctions, military threats, the engagement in force posturing.
Each round produced a little progress and a lot of distrust. Then, on June 7th, Israel struck Hezbollah's stronghold in the Defiance suburb of Beirut. Iran, which had stayed out of direct strikes on Israel for weeks under the fragile ceasefire, responded with a volley of ballistic missiles into northern Israel. It was the first time Tehran had fired directly at Israel since that ceasefire began, and it nearly took the entire negotiation down with it. This is the moment that tells you everything about who actually controls what happens next. In the hours after that missile attack, President Trump gave an interview to the Financial Times, and a reporter asked him whether Netanyahu would have any say and whether Israel accepted a deal with Iran. Trump's answer? Word for word, he won't have any choice. I call the shots. I call all the shots. He doesn't call the shots. That is the President of the United States on the record telling the world that Israel's Prime Minister does not get a vote in this. Reports at the time also described Trump as furious enough at the Beirut strike to use blunt expletive-laced language with Netanyahu directly, telling him to stand down before Iran's response made things worse. So by the time the actual framework got signed a week later, you would reasonably expect Israel to fall in line. The president had just said in public that Israel doesn't get to call the shots. Here's what actually happened. On Sunday, June 14th, the U.S. and Iran announced they had reached a framework. a 60-day ceasefire, the Strait of Hormuz reopening, a path toward technical talks on Iran's nuclear program. The following day, Trump and Vice President Vance electronically signed the memorandum, with Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf signed for Tehran. A formal in-person ceremony is scheduled for Friday, June 19th in Geneva. And on that same Monday, before the ink on the electronic signature was even a day old, Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, made a public statement. Israeli forces, he said, would remain in the security zones his country has seized in Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza indefinitely, without a deadline. He added that those zones would be cleared of residents and that structures in them would be destroyed. Indefinitely is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Iran had said for weeks that any deal with the United States has to come with an end to Israeli operations in Lebanon. Katz's statement is a direct answer to that condition, and the answer is no. It got more direct from there. Israel's far-right national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, said flatly that the agreement Trump signed does not bind us. Netanyahu himself, asked about the deal, avoided endorsing it outright, saying only that he and Trump do not always see eye to eye, while making clear Israel has no plans to withdraw from Lebanon, Gaza, or Syria. And on the day this video was written, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, responded directly. Any further Israeli military action in Lebanon, he said, or continued occupation of Lebanese territory will be treated by Iran as a violation of the memorandum the United States just signed. So within 48 hours, you have the President of the United States declaring that he, not Netanyahu, calls the shots. And you have Israel publicly, repeatedly on the record, doing the opposite of what that deal requires. That is not a footnote, that is the actual story. There are two numbers that explain why almost nobody in Washington is willing to say what you just heard out loud, and why this framework is more fragile than the headlines suggest. The first number is $24 billion. That is roughly the amount of frozen Iranian assets sitting at the center of this deal. Iran's own Revolutionary Guard has said publicly that the country expects to receive half of that, around $12 billion, before the 60-day window for final negotiations even begins. American officials have said the opposite, that this is what one senior official called a pay-for-performance deal, and that Iran will not see a dollar of those funds released until it demonstrates compliance with the agreement's terms. Those two positions cannot both be true. One side is going to be publicly wronged about what they signed, and that gap alone is enough to blow this framework apart before the 60 days are up. The second number is harder to find because almost no one wants you looking at it. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the AIPAC, has delivered roughly $28 million directly to congressional campaigns in this election cycle alone.
AIPAC has been building this influence in Washington, as Usama said, for half a century to maintain silence within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. According
to an analysis of Federal Election Commission's filings, its affiliated super PAC, the United Democracy Project, entered this cycle with roughly $96 million on hand. Pro-Israel political action committees as a group are sitting on more than $100 million to spend on the midterms. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a publicly disclosed number sitting in federal filings that anyone can look up. And it is the single most important reason why no member of Congress from either party is willing to stand up and say what Katz, Ben-Gvir, and Netanyahu just said in public, that Israel intends to ignore part of the deal the President of the United States personally signed. Criticizing that decision, even mildly, carries a real political cost that most members of Congress are simply not willing to pay. Here's why this matters beyond a single news cycle. This deal was supposed to close out a war that has already cost the American taxpayer billions of dollars and pushed oil and crop prices around the world. The 60-day negotiating window only works if both sides believe the other is actually bound by what was signed. The moment one party announces in public, on the record, that a major term doesn't apply to them, you don't have a ceasefire anymore. You have a temporary pause with an expiration date nobody has named yet. And Lebanon is the most likely place that pause breaks. Iran has already drawn the line publicly. Israel has already said it won't move. If Israeli strikes continue in southern Lebanon and Iran follows through on calling that a violation, the United States is suddenly in the position of explaining why an ally it does not fully control just undermined an agreement it brokered. That is not a hypothetical. Both sides have already said this week exactly what they would do if the other side crosses that line. This is also a preview of something bigger than this one deal. The United States has spent enormous political and financial capital trying to end a war it was dragged into, and the actor it has the least leverage over. On paper, its closest ally in the region is the one openly refusing to fall in line. If that pattern holds, it tells you something uncomfortable about how much control Washington actually has over outcomes it claims to be steering. To be fair to Israel's position, this isn't simply stubbornness for its own sake. Israeli officials point to October 7, 2023, and to years of rocket fire out of Lebanon as the reason they will not walk away from buffer zones they believe prevent another surprise attack. From their perspective, withdrawing from those positions on the word of a deal they weren't fully consulted on, one they admit they don't even know the full details of, would be reckless. Netanyahu has not torched the relationship with Trump either. He has carefully avoided saying anything that sounds like outright defiance of the president personally, even while his ministers say things that amount to exactly that. It's also worth saying plainly that allies disagreeing in public is not automatically a crisis. The U.S. and Israel have had friction over Iran policies for years, and the relationship has survived it every time. It's possible this settles down the same way. It's possible the 60-day window gives everyone room to quietly walk back the sharper statements. Disagreement between allies is normal. What's less normal is doing it this loudly, this fast, about a deal this significant. So when you ask who really wants this deal, the honest answer might be more complicated than it looks. The United States wanted it badly enough that the president was willing to publicly diminish his closest regional ally to get it. Iran wanted it badly enough to sign before the funds dispute was even settled. And Israel, the country with the most at stake, is how this region looks 6 months from now. Signaled within 48 hours that it considered itself bound by exactly none of it where Lebanon is concerned. That is why the real skepticism here shouldn't be aimed at Tehran. The greatest threat to this framework agreement may not come from the country that just signed it. It may come from inside the alliance that was supposed to be celebrating it. If you think Israel is right to act independently here no matter what Washington signs, say so in the comments. If you think this is exactly the kind of fracture that eventually breaks an alliance, say that too. Don't forget to hit subscribe because we are just getting started.